Hello gamers, Powered Heal here, and today we're going to be talking about KT versus Sapphiron. Which boss is harder? And as you can guess by the title, I have an opinion on this. I think I might be in the minority, but that's why we make the videos, right? I kind of want to explain my thoughts and my reasoning, and I think it's particularly pertinent because this is going to be, hopefully, my first KT and Saph kill as we're going in tonight to try and get Survivor the Damned with full send on Doomhowl. So should be really fun, and you can check that out 9 p.m. EST. Yeah, should be exciting and thrilling. Tried to make this video already. Turns out that I actually had my mic muted, so I guess this is round two. But yeah, I think if you were to like poll a bunch of people, first of all, I think even just perception wise, even for people who haven't done the fight, like just from what they've heard about the fights, a lot of people give Sapphiron the edge here and say this is the hardest fight in Classic WoW. I've heard that said a bunch of times, and I think that they're very close. They're very similar. Well, I don't think the fights are similar. The difficulty is similar. It's expressed in sort of different ways, but personally, I think KT just edges out Sapphiron most of the time in my mind, and I want to kind of talk about both fights, get into the nuances, and explain what's going on there. So I guess I will start a bit with Sapphiron, and I think the main thing to keep in mind with Sapphiron is that this fight is more of a gear check than anything else. And it's a little bit weird to say because personally, I think if you had exceptional players like healers who knew what they were doing and were trying to be efficient, okay, and then you had damage dealers who were capable of pumping a lot of damage, the difficulty of this fight, and obviously people who are not making very obvious mistakes, right, the difficulty of this fight drops precipitously. That's just the reality. I feel like it can be done in surprisingly little gear, despite the fact that it is commonly thought of as a gear check. I think that most of the gear check aspect of it comes down to the fact that, a lot of times you're not dealing with, like you have a 40-man raid, right? So not all your players typically are going to be like playing up to the highest possible level, both on the healing side and on the damage side, which means that there's kind of like a lot of left on the table, and you really do need kind of every bit of damage and healing you can get, because it is a damage healing intensive fight in the very least, but that's mostly all it is, right? There's not many other mechanics active. So what other mechanics do you have to deal with, right, other than just the constant ticking frost damage? Well, you have the curse, right, but that should be easily dealt with. You have probably at least one druid and at least 2 to 3 mages in your raid, right? I think it only goes on like 3 to 4 people at a time, if I remember. So realistically, like if you're playing with people who know their stuff, it should be like instantly disappearing almost as soon as it comes up. Like it shouldn't really have time to funnel him much health. It probably can be first ticked, to be honest. Like it can probably be dispelled before it even does damage or gives damage back to him. I'm not entirely sure on that. It would just depend on if it ticks instantly or not, right? But if it doesn't tick instantly, if it's kind of like the thing like the Visc poison, then you should be able to one-tick it and almost have Saf get no healing back from any of these targets, right? So I don't really think that's a big issue. The one thing on this is like sometimes the spread, like you obviously want to spread out, and typically you're on one side of the boss so that you can hit more people with the healing. The problem is that even when you're doing that, obviously you still want a decent spread to avoid things like the blizzards, and then you want it to be easy to spread naturally once you're in the block phase. So you can't always hit people, just depending on where you are as a healer. However, your decursors in particular should be positioned in a way where they're kind of more towards the middle, or at least have some on each end where they can deal with getting people. So you might have some people, like if all the people on the left side get cursed, not all of them, but like if like 3 or 4 on the left side get cursed, and that's where all the curses go, and then you maybe have like only 2 decursors there, right? Maybe a couple ticks go off, but it's not going to be a big concern, right? It's just not a huge deal. So the other mechanic, the cleave, there's some people who do this boss where they have the healers behind the main tank. I don't like this strategy. I think it's so easy for them to just be a little too close and catch a cleave, because the cleave range is quite large. and then it can also chain. So only takes like one of your healers to be out of position, and all of them get hit. If that makes sense. So not really a fan of that strategy, and the cleave shouldn't really be an issue in most cases. Going to the actual main mechanic of the fight, which is the Frost Tomes, I think the only thing you really have to worry about on Sapphiron is just making sure that you do not stack up, you know, while the tombs are going out. That's the main part of this fight, right? If you can avoid everybody stacking before all the tombs are out, then it's going to be really easy, because the Frost Tomb does about 5k damage. Now, I'm not entirely sure what the collateral damage on the Frost Tomb does. So, for example, if somebody gets tombed on Sapphiron, they take 5-ish k. Can't be resisted from what it seems like. And then everybody around them that's in the range that kind of got hit, quote unquote, by the ice block will take damage as well. Now, I'm not sure if they take the full damage. It may be different, where that damage probably can be resisted, and it's probably not the full damage, I would assume, but it's still a heavy chunk of damage. It's probably something like at least 2 or 3k, which is insane, right? So if you have a bunch of people getting hit by that, and that can overlap multiple times, so if you have 2 tombs close to each other, right, and somebody gets hit by the splash from both tombs, that person is probably dead. So that's quite bad. Of course, it's not really going to play out like that in most cases, because the tombs come out one at a time. But I mean, if somebody took one from one and then took one from another and didn't get enough heals in between, that would be quite bad. So realistically, the main mechanic of this fight is just making sure you're spread enough and you have ample time to get to your tomb, realistically. A lot of classes also have, like, mages have blink, paladin can bubble if they really need to. So you have classes like that. And ideally, those classes should probably be kind of the last to sort of get in. And then, because they have the option if they need to. They have an emergency button, right? But realistically, you shouldn't even be having to use those things, because you just have enough time, right? You just wait until, like, the 3rd or 4th tomb. You're looking for people, seeing where the tombs are. You inch your way towards them. You can move early to some degree, as long as you're moving with the group and keeping the distance between you and the other players in mind, right? You just don't want to clump up at the actual tombs or anything like that. You can start moving towards them a little earlier, as long as you're respecting other people's positions. So that is the main portion of the fight. I think that's where most people fail. And I think that, when you look at the fight, we were actually, we had a healer meeting the other night where we were kind of going over things, and one of the videos that was linked to us was from a past Sapphiron that they did, and there was somebody in the Discord call, because this was a video of a past healer meeting where they were actually showing what went wrong on this fight, and somebody was like, wow, this fight does a lot of damage, huh? Like, this boss is crazy. But what they were actually seeing, like, this guy thought that the raid was falling behind on healing. It really wasn't falling behind on healing. It was more just that there were too many collateral hits of the Frost Tomb splash, and that will set you behind on healing almost no matter what. You could be like the most healer, you could be the most geared healer, the best healer, and if too many people splash the tombs, you're going to be in a really rough spot. They didn't even wipe, even though they did lose some people to the collats, and even by the end of the fight, they had most people back to kind of like full health. Right, so even in a bad scenario like that, the ticking damage, in my opinion, it's sort of very overstated, especially if your melee have the proper frost resist and stuff like that. So it's really more of a fight of, do you have the frost resist gear on the right people? Do you have enough gear in general? And really enough gear, I think, is, have you been clearing AQ40 before the release of Nax? Right now, obviously, the state of the servers now, it's a little bit different because everything's out already. But if you were assuming this was like an anniversary type of thing, then you should have enough gear to kill Saf going into Nax for the first time, in my opinion. Potentially depends on the frost resist situation, but I think, like, even without ideal frost resist, you should be able to kill this boss. Like, on hardcore, I probably wouldn't recommend doing that. Like, it probably just makes more sense to skip a lockout or something. Make sure you get all the frost res you need on your melee DPS and your ranged, but yeah, I mean, I think for most guilds, the gear is not really a problem. Just having more gear obviously helps, right? So it's considered a gear check fight. It is to a degree, because the gear nerfs, like, the main mechanic, which is the it just gives you way more healing to deal with the outgoing damage, and then it gives you way more damage to make the fight shorter, so you don't have to be in that phase for as long, right? So, yeah, that's kind of like my thoughts on Sapphiron. Just not really a hard fight mechanically. And let's move on to KT then. So KT, I think, is a lot trickier of a fight because he just has a lot more in his arsenal, and the way that the abilities overlap can be quite tricky. One more thing I did want to mention about Sapphiron, there is the blizzards, but the blizzards, people freak out over the blizzards too much. Like, realistically, what's going to happen is you're either going to, get blizzard on you or you're not, and if you're not, you have a relatively easy time, and you just get to do more healing, more damage, or whatever. And if you do get blizzard on you, you just have to kind of bear with it and try and get out of it as much as possible, right? They're not like hyper fast or anything like that, so people really overrate the whole blizzard thing. But that's just my thoughts. So going into KT, like I said, there's more that can go wrong in this fight because it's a more layered fight, or it's a more complex fight, and the way it gets layered can add to that complexity. So we'll start with phase one. Phase one, just like super easy for the most part. Not really much should go wrong. At the end of phase one, it seems like the way that they do it is that it kind of gets intentionally a bit more chaotic, like more stuff is coming at the end. So if you're going to take like stray damage from skeletons getting to the center, it's going to be towards the end, but realistically shouldn't be that much of a problem. The fight really begins in phase two, where everybody has to spread out into their positions, and there's a couple major mechanics. Right now, the one everybody looks at all the time is Frost Tomb. Especially on hardcore, this is the one that you're kind of briefed about the most on a healer, right? And it makes sense, especially for hardcore, because for hardcore, you obviously don't have the luxury of having somebody die to a tomb, if that makes sense, right? On normal, you could get melee tombed every time and, heal 3 out of like 4 of them or whatever, however many are in that group, and you're still killing the boss like every day of the week, right? Like you'll kill that every reset with 1 or 2 people dying, potentially even on each tomb, especially if you only get 1 tomb. Sometimes if you have really good damage and you get really good RNG, you can get 1 tomb. And even if you were to lose 2 people on that tomb, the boss is dying, right? So on softcore, not as big of an issue, but on hardcore, obviously, a lot more emphasis gets put on the tombs because, you can't just be losing 2 raiders or even a raider a week to Frost Tombs on KT, right? It's just not something that's really, like, sustainable. Because people have so much time invested, they have so much gear. Even if you discount the human factor of, like, how much it sucks to die in the end game on hardcore in this game, it would actually be hard to sustain a raid in the sense of, like, you could get another body in there, but they're not going to be as geared, as prepared, right? So, yeah, that's something on KT. Then the thing, though, that I think that really separates KT from Sapphiron and kind of throws, it's like the wild card or like the Joker aspect to all of this, is the mind controls. The mind controls on KT are devastating, and the frequency of the mind controls, in my opinion, often dictates exactly how chaotic the fight becomes, right? If you have a KT where he does very little mind controls, then the fight's going to actually seem incredibly easy. And I think that this is actually where the perception that KT is like the easier fight than Sapphiron comes into play. It's just like the frequency of the abilities. If you have good damage, you have all your world buffs, and KT doesn't hit you with that many abilities, or maybe like crucial players don't get hit with certain abilities like the mind control, the fight can actually seem very easy. Powered heals phone. I guess it shut off. Maybe it's out of battery. Yeah, so the frequency of things like the mind control, I think, are actually like the most important, because the mind control can just throw a wrench into so many things. First of all, it's somebody that's just beating on your raiders, right? And obviously the answer to this is you're going to use things like sleep dust, you're going to use things like poly, stuns, all that stuff, right? That's all great. Problem is, it's not going to come out instantly, and sometimes it doesn't come out perfectly. Sometimes the people that you're telling to sheep certain things get mind control, which is why really all the mages need to be just looking to sheep mind controls and stuff like that. Everybody wants to be looking out to use things like a sleep dust or a Hodge or something like that. The more people you have on it, the better, because these things will have some form of uptime, right? They're not gonna. It's not like they're instantly being palm polyed or something, and you're not gonna have to deal with them. You're gonna have to deal with them a little bit, and when they're active, people can do a lot of damage, which is why it's worth it to always have every protection potion, in my opinion, popped in this fight, because you never know. It's not really a firefight, but a mage could just cast a huge fireball at you, right? Or something like that. Arcane Explosion, a huge starfire could come out from a druid, right? Which might actually hurt if they have a decent amount of healing power. So there's kind of all these things on the fight that could happen via the MCs, and this isn't even counting the CC abilities, right? Which in most cases, yes, you're supposed to make sure that your CC is down before entering into the fight. Sometimes people forget. I've seen melee stacks feared, which is terrible. But all of this stuff, it just adds more variables that can make the fight go wrong, even if you kind of took all the care and planning beforehand. So even if you used all your CC abilities and stuff like that, broke, all your fears, the mind controls can still be a bit of an issue, especially if they go on bad targets or targets that already have a responsibility. And then if the sheeps don't come out quick, or you have some of those crowd control abilities left up, they can cause real havoc in the raid. So yeah, mind control I think is really the biggest thing, and how frequency that ability goes out. And like I said, I think the frequency of the abilities in general, like how many tombs in particular and how many mind controls you get. Like if you get a lot of tombs and a lot of mind controls, the fight's going to seem hard. If you don't get many, the fight's going to seem really easy. Also, there's not really a way to cheese KT in the same way that Saph can sort of be cheesed with things like Thaddeus Polarity, and a way, kind of easier way to deal with something like getting more damage on Saph is actually just to use Lotheb Spores. So yeah, I mean, you don't actually even need to go super risky and do something like Saph or Thad Polarity, or Saph Polarity as they call it, in order to get a damage boost on something like Saph. There's not really a way to get an equivalent boost on KT, which means that you kind of just have to deal with the fight with all your own buffs and everything as best as you can, right? There's Detonate Mana, and I have a funny Detonate Mana story. So it was a couple weeks ago, we watched a guild, and they had this shaman who was pretty geared, but didn't seem to really invest into stamina, and wasn't using a Titan's Flask, which I think is mostly a mistake. I think you should kind of always go into this flask, or this fight. Well, it depends on... It really does depend on how much gold you have, right? But ideally, you would go in with the Titans on, and then you would use the Distilled Wisdom if you ran out of mana, because you want a lot of HP for this fight. What basically happened was a priest got Detonate Mana early in the fight, and Detonate Mana is very deadly on a priest in particular, because priests tend to have a lot of mana, and it's probably the same with mages and warlocks to some degree. But as a paladin, you don't usually have as much of a problem, because you have really good mana regen. You're not focusing explicitly on a big raw mana pool. I have 6 to probably 7 to 8k mana fully raid buffed. And basically what happened was this priest, they got a Shadow Fissure with the Detonate Mana, and they had to run away. So what they did is they ran back onto another player, which is kind of the right decision. I'll talk about that in a moment. And the Detonate Mana went off, and it just one-shot the shaman. Now, I think it actually did 6k damage, because the priest had close to 13k mana. It was 12 point something. It was an insanely geared priest, very endgame. And the shaman only had 6k HP, and I believe it does around half. And there was no Nature Protection potion up. Sounds weird, but Nature Protection is actually the type of protection that protects against this Detonate Mana. You would think it would be Arcane Protection or something. Again, you should have every protection potion pop, because mind controls can damage you and stuff. But yeah, this shaman just got one shot, basically, from the Detonate Mana. So that's why you want HP on hardcore. You want your protection potions rolling. Not worth it to skimp on stuff like that, right? So Detonate Mana can be a little bit of a problem. The thing is, though, is that the range on it, it says it's 10 yards. And, it looks like it's smaller than that, because we had a thing where we actually looked back at some of the VODs the other day. We had that healer meeting, and there was a mage that was in range of the priest that we were watching when he had Detonate Mana, and he actually did not hit the priest with the 10-yard radius. So I think it's a little bit, it's probably like 5 yards or something like that. You have to be pretty close to somebody, but it is something to just keep in mind. And it's one of those things where detonate mana by itself, not really a mechanic worth worrying about, but when it combines with other mechanics, when all these things are going out at the same time, kind of like what happened to the priest, right? They got the Shadow Fissure, they had to move, they ran onto somebody else, and then the detonate mana popped off. Now, did they have enough room to move and not go on somebody else? Probably, in the sense that the detonate mana is so small of a range, I think, in actuality. What probably happens is a lot of people see these yardage values on Wowhead, and they take them as like Bible, right? Which kind of makes sense, because you would rather be anticipating something have a larger range than a shorter range, right? So I think what probably happens is the priest is thinking they're going to hit the target anyway because they're in the 10-yard range. So they just run on top to make sure that, they don't chain Frost Tomb to anybody else, because you don't want to be chaining Frost Tomb to anybody else trying to run away from a fissure, which is something you have to keep in mind, which is why running towards a player, as long as you're not running towards the melee stack, running towards a player on KT when you have something like detonate mana, it actually does make sense, in the sense that, like, what you don't want to be is you don't want to be kind of like, I'm perfectly between 3 players, but I'm actually like within 3 yards of them all, right? Because then you'll chain Frost Tomb to those players if Frost Tomb goes out, right? And potentially you might even detonate mana on multiple people, right? So you'd rather detonate it on one person who should have a protection potion active, and then if you get tombed, you have you're only tombing one other person, rather than tombing like 3 or 4 people in the ranged, or detonating the mana on the ranged. I've actually also seen something crazy where a priest gets it, or I don't know if it was a priest, or I think it was a priest, and they run into melee and they detonate it on the entire melee stack. So that's something that it's not good, and again, it's something that tends to happen in the later phases of the fight. And the late phase of the fight in particular is very chaotic, right, in a way that Sap isn't, because they add in the new mechanic of the new mobs coming in. This can kind of go different ways, right? If the shackles come out great, the priests are in range right away, and the warriors can pick the stuff up, it's not really that bad, right? And you don't really feel the difference here, but all sorts of stuff can still happen in this last phase, right? The Frost Blast can still go out, so your tank that is tanking one of the ads can get Frost Blasted, right? That means he's now taking a bunch of damage and probably loses aggro on the ad. It goes off and is starting to attack people. The ads can get into melee. People are trying to drag them out. Frost Tombs can go off, right? So there's a bunch of things that can potentially change the positioning of players that would normally just be in their normal spot, and that's where things start to break down. And sometimes just like somebody being out of position a little bit can have a catastrophic effect on the raid in a way that it probably wouldn't on Sapphiron, right? Because it's just less likely that somebody, I think, is going to chain an ice block splash to the same degree that they would, because I think what it is the ice block itself on Saf, the one that comes down, is only doing damage around the ice block. So if you have, like, if somebody is where I'm standing here, right, and they get ice blocked, and then you're here, and you're too close, and you get hit by the block, you'll take the damage, but you're not going to chain the damage to the guy that's standing over here and is far away. The problem on KT is these 3 people would be tombed, because it does chain between players, right? So that's the big kind of X factor, is once the positioning starts to break down because something went wrong or something like that, now everything's a lot more dangerous on a fight like KT. And because the fight is just less predictable in nature, given that, you have the mind controls, you have the ads coming out, you have potentially some people using crowd control abilities when they're MC'd, even though, again, they should be down, but people make mistakes and forget to do things right. So all these things kind of factored in, and then the boss actually still hits really hard throughout a lot of this, and the Frost Tombs are still doing a lot of damage, so there's just a lot of very deadly mechanics. The Void Zones, right, super deadly. They just kill you basically in 2 to 3 seconds. There's no way, there's no protection potions, there's no HP value. It's not like on 4 Horsemen even, with the Void Zones, where you could take 2 ticks if you had 9k HP, which you probably should on a fight like this. You're just gone. So there's just a lot more things to worry about, a lot of things that are going to move people's positioning, potentially cause people to panic, run into other people and stuff like that. And that's why I think KT is just ultimately a harder fight than Sapphiron. I would say definitely on hardcore, I'm more scared of it. But I think even on softcore, to some degree, it's a fight where it's going to be more problematic for your guild on the regular. I think once you kind of get the gear for Saph, you're going to be able to walk in there, and once you understand the positioning, you can probably execute that fight on softcore every week and barely lose people or something like that, right? But on hardcore, or sorry, not on hardcore, but on KT, you might be a guild that, like, if you're on softcore, you just lose people to Frostblast, like, every week, or you just, like, lose people to some random combination of an MC going bad or something like that. And this is not even counting the bugs, which is the last thing I'll be talking about. So the bugs on KT are pretty severe, and from what I've seen, it usually has to do with two abilities trying to go off at the same time. So they kind of like batch. So the main culprits here tend to be, we already talked about one, right? If you get the detonate mana at the same time as the void zone, you can kind of run into people and hurt people. That's not even the biggest deal, though, because people should have, probably above 8k HP, and they also should have, a protection potion pop. So that's not the biggest deal in the world. What's really worse is when Mind Control goes out at the same time as Frost Tomb, because there's this mechanic where, because the main tank pretty much always gets Mind Controlled, if the main tank gets Frost Tombed and Mind Control, so if you select it as a Mind Control target, what happens is the damage on that's supposed to be going into the tank, because he's no longer an eligible target, it actually swaps to the off tank, which is really bad because the off tank is now taking the boss damage plus the Ice Tomb damage, but you have no visual indicator that he's actually taking Ice Tomb damage, right? So it's like super, super bad, super sketchy, super dangerous. We've even seen it do ticks on other Ice Tomb members. So, for example, in one of the VODs we were reviewing, that happened where the main tank got Frost Tombed and Mind Controlled, and then the off tank took 3 ticks from the main tank's Frost Block, and a rogue that had also gotten tombed took 5 ticks instead of the normal 4. So the rogue actually took another tick out of nowhere and almost died. So it's just, with that bug going on, or, I would consider it a bug, but, maybe in Blizzard's terms, it's just, hey, the damage is still going out, it's just going out on different people because the target's ineligible, but it makes it really difficult to see. It makes the fight even more chaotic, right? So, yeah, if the things are coming out at the same time, it's a really rough fight, and you just have to really be ready. So ultimately, I think KT just has more in its bag of tricks, and that's kind of how I feel. One last thing that I will mention is I think for Horde, if you want to make the argument that Saph is the harder fight, then you have a bit more ground to stand on, and I wouldn't really argue with somebody there, I feel like, especially if you're not very geared, because like Alliance is just so much more efficient, and basically Sapphiron exposes the inefficiency of the Horde. So unless you're doing something like spamming a crazy amount of Distilled Wisdoms, Horde is just way more, or Horde is way less efficient. Like, you think a Horde, like, oh, Chain Heal's so amazing. Chain Heal costs a lot of mana, right? And there's a lot of overhealing done by Chain Heal. It's not the same as, like, being able to predict healing on your Prayer of Healing and see exactly how much everybody's HP is going to go up and not waste a lot of healing there, right? Or just layering your renews properly, right? Where they're almost certainly going to get value because it's a rot fight. It's not going to be like that on Horde. There's going to be a lot of Chain Heals firing off. They're going to do a lot of healing, but they're also going to do a lot of overhealing. And that's going to bite you if you don't get the fight over really fast. So for Horde in particular, that's not like going crazy, spamming wisdoms and stuff like that, then I can understand some people thinking, hey, this is the harder fight, because Horde is strapped on resources so much more than Alliance from a healing perspective. They don't have kings, they don't have wisdom, right? So the mana pool is less, the mana regen is less, and it really shows up big in the fight. But even more than those two things, just the style of healing is more mana inefficient. That is just the bottom line, right? So that's gonna show up in the actual fight, like later on in the fight with people going and stuff. So that's kind of my last like little point or caveat, that if you're Horde, I can kind of understand saying Saph is the hardest fight in the game, But yeah, that's my thoughts. Let me know what you guys think down below, and come check out the hopefully Saf and KT kill tonight at 9 p.m. server. I'll link the Twitch down below. And yeah, hopefully we're Survivor of the Damned in a couple hours. So I'll see you guys.